On the Strait of Hormuz crisis, I can tell you the effects of it being staying closed for long, but I can't tell you if it's going to stay closed. Let me just ask you because
Man,
you
this is
follow
the
this
second time. This
more
is the
closely.
second time I want to mention something. You bring it up. I wanted to ask about what you think of the price of gold. You answered it. I'm like, all right. I wrote a note. How concerned are you about the war restarting and Strait of Hormuz closing? That was my next question to ask you. Bring it back to that.
Yeah,
And
well, yeah, where I could read your mind, Mario. I don't mean to front run your question. I apologize, but yeah, that's next logical step here. How concerned am I? I'm very concerned. I don't think that the economy has fully priced in yet the negative effects, the downside effects of higher oil. And I say that it's been 3 months, more than 100 days since the war began, but it takes a little bit longer usually for the, for a shock to be fully absorbed. I do think that the economy is less dependent on the price of oil now than it was in the late 70s, which is to say that a major oil shock today will probably not have the same kind of effect as it did on the early 80s and late 70s. A lot of people have different modes of transportation now. There's electric vehicles. Not everybody has an electric vehicle, but that does absorb some of the shock. Now, most of the S&P is now in tech, and tech's margins aren't significantly affected by a higher fixed price of oil. And so I think markets overall would not be as impacted on the price, the price of oil.
What about the gas? What about the LNG that comes out of the Strait of Hormuz? How does that have much of an impact on the tech sector? The helium that is needed for the chips.
Okay, so let me just talk about helium. So more than, I don't know the exact number, but it's between 45 to 50% of Taiwan's helium comes from the GCC countries. 40 to 50% of South Korea's helium comes from the GCC countries. Now, helium is an important input on the production of semiconductors. It's used for cooling. I don't know exactly how much helium is needed. I just know that about half of the helium from the 2 largest countries of semiconductor production come from the GCC. So that's been choked up. LNG is mostly for Asia and Europe and North America. And I saw comments from my show last year. I said the US, produce a lot of oil. They also import a lot of oil. Yes, but they're still big exporters of oil. And there's a lot of production from the US that goes into domestic consumption as well. So yes, the US imports oil and refined oil of different refinement qualities, but they do also consume the oil that they produce. Now, your question was what happens to LNG and helium? Yeah, a lot of that goes to Europe and Asia. The biggest movers, I expect this Monday would probably be the Korean stock index and the Taiwanese stock index that responded as well to the closure of the Strait of Hormuz more aggressively than U.S. markets did the first time. I think that the longer here's the bottom line for those of us watching at home. How does the Strait of Hormuz impact us in the West? I'm in Canada, but Americans as well. It impacts us through the financial system. The longer the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, the higher we can expect inflation expectations to go, and the longer we can expect higher inflation expectations to stay longer. That means higher bond yields. That means the Fed will raise interest rates. That means the 10-year yield, which we talked about extensively last time on your show, will stay high, go towards 5%. It's currently at 4.5%. And that impacts borrowing costs. Your credit cards will probably be more expensive. Your mortgage won't go down. It'll go up if you're getting a new mortgage rate. If you're in Canada, if you have a variable rate, we Americans don't have a variable rate, but in Canada, we have a 3 to 5 year variable rate. If you're up for renewal or refinancing, you're not going to get a lower rate. You're going to get a higher one. It impacts monetary policy around the world, not just in the US. The ECB just raised rates for the first time in years last week. The Bank of Japan was already raising rates. This impacts monetary policy globally. It impacts the money supply globally. We're in a global monetary tightening regime, which means less liquidity for the banks, which means less loans issued by the banks, and which means higher borrowing costs for everybody, including the everyday person. It just means that everybody has less liquidity at the end of the day. So the faster this gets resolved, the sooner we have a normalization, which is to say, lower inflation expectations. Now, if you're of the view that inflation expectations shouldn't impact monetary policy the way that it has, meaning that the rates should go up anyways, that's a different story. There are some people who believe that even at the current inflation rate, even a bit lower, the Fed should have a higher interest rate. Perhaps that's true, but it's fair to say that the Fed is doing what they believe is right, not what they believe economists say is right. So some people say that, by the way, Jerome Powell lowered interest rates last year or 2 years ago, right before the election, because he wanted to help the Democrats. That's a common viewpoint by economists, that Powell was acting politically, and so interest rates should be higher anyways. I think there is no direct evidence to support that, but based on circumstantial evidence, I think we can draw that conclusion. There was no reason for the economy. The economy wasn't showing signs of a recession in 2024. The stock market wasn't collapsing. People weren't losing their jobs left and right. The unemployment rate wasn't rising. And so why did he need to lower the inflation? Was not collapsing. I mean, it was above 2%. It wasn't below 2. So what was the actual reason for lowering interest rates? I personally can't find any good reasons for lowering interest rates. The timing was a little bit suspicious. Why lower interest rates the fall or a couple months before the election? I don't know. No direct evidence to support that, of course, but circumstantial evidence points to the fact that he didn't need to lower interest rates back then. And now, of course, they have to play catch up to redo some of the things that Powell did. I'm not saying Powell caused inflation. Powell didn't cause the Strait of Hormuz to close. I'm just saying that his aggressive, or I would say his looser monetary policy certainly didn't help the inflation rate that we're seeing today. Now, back to your question. Yes, the Strait of Hormuz closure does worry me to the extent that higher inflation expectations would put more pressure on central banks all around the world to keep money supply tight, which is ultimately bad for businesses and bad for the consumer.
That's a great overview. You're really good at this. You should do less interviews. You should conduct less interviews and be an interviewee more often.
I feel like my guests are a lot smarter than me, which is why I suggest people listen to the guests on my show and yours for even better analysis. But thank you. Appreciate that.
Last thing I'll ask you about briefly is the G7 summit. I think you covered that on your show as well. Anything interesting there?
Besides Trump proclaiming that he's the boss.
Besides them, have you seen him now? He's fighting with Meloni from Italy.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on there. No, I think, again, you cover the political side better than me. You understand the nuances better than me. I'll defer to you to comment on what happened on the political side. I listened to parts of Trump's speech when he made an hour speech on stage at the G7 summit. Several highlights stood out. First, he said that it's important for the Strait of Hormuz to remain open. He highlighted the fact that higher oil causes inflation. Now, that's up to great academic debate. I'm just telling you that's what he said, and that's his justification for signing the deal. But of course, that's all in retrospect. We know none of that matters anymore as long as Israel keeps bombing Lebanon. So this is a moot point, what he said on stage. I agree with him that he needs to resolve this issue for the sake of global stability as soon as possible, and for the sake of everybody's living standards to improve. This needs to be resolved. It's going to take a while before oil pipelines bypassing the Strait of Hormuz are completed. You're in the UAE, and the UAE is currently building a pipeline. I don't know if you've been following that story, so you'll know better than me when that's going to get completed, but not anytime soon. So yes, he needs to work something out with Israel. Otherwise, we're all gonna businesses worldwide are gonna not do well.
And Iran Iran is using. Go ahead, finish your point first.
No, that was it. Now, please continue.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, just a funny thing is that Iran knows this. They're very astute, and they're trying. Now they shut the Strait of Hormuz, and they blamed Israel. Technically, Israel, who didn't sign the MOU, is breaching the MOU, but they blamed Israel, and they're trying to paint Israel as the villain or blame the economic issues around the world on Israel. To try to cause that split politically between the US and Israel. I know it's a political discussion, but it's just linked on the economic impact of the Strait of Hormuz. And you just said it yourself. For Trump to be able to deliver on his promises, he needs to sort Israel. And that's the exact messaging that Iran wants to achieve by doing what they're doing and the statements they are making. It's just been fascinating to watch from a political
Let me just ask you, I know this is your interview, but I'm just very curious to know your standpoint, because you know better than, what does Israel want at this point? Because from the conversations I've had with economists, the U.S. has failed in reaching its strategic objective to overthrow the regime of Iran. They decapitated leadership, but the regime is still there. So at this point, what else can be done? Right?
They're just, so you can ask what Israel wants and what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu is trying to achieve a political win. Iran has been a disaster. Gaza's not going too well. So he needs to get something in Hezbollah, putting aside the legal issues he's facing. And if he stops the wars, he has to face, he has to have his day in court. But he needs to achieve a political win before the elections in October. And the only win he could achieve now after the losses in Iran and the lack of achievements in Gaza is in Lebanon with Hezbollah. So that's what Netanyahu is trying to achieve. And that's the issue, because Iran doesn't want to allow him to achieve it. And Trump is stuck in the middle, trying to stop Netanyahu while trying to get a deal with Iran. So
Trump has made it also very clear prior to the G7 summit. I know your question was on G7, but before he said that, look, the rest of the world needs the Strait of Hormuz more than the U.S. does. I'm paraphrasing, but he's basically asking the allies to step in. He was asking the French and the British to send warships. They're like, no, we're not going to do that. But he's right. Europeans need the GCC countries more for oil. The Asians need the Strait of Hormuz more than North Americans do. So, you know, he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. You know, he wants to continue the pressure, but at the same time, his allies are saying, no, like let's fix this and let's move on so everybody doesn't suffer from $100 a barrel, which is what's going to happen. I promise you, if the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, we're going to see $100 by September if it stays closed again.